Greetings, students. Last time we were talking, we were examining the heart of the goal of the philosophy of the Upanishads, which was moksha, or liberation. And we were thinking about how that's how to understand all the things done in these philosophies. As I said previously, in modern culture, we find separate disciplines or departments of thought. We have religion, psychology, medicine, exercise, diet, and so forth. And while classical Indian thinkers acknowledge the distinctions, which are real, they claim they are all truly interdependent because reality cannot be intelligently understood as cut up into little separate pieces like that. Because in this philosophy of the Upanishads, all logic, conceptual analysis, and argument are done in terms of the way of life that leads to liberation. So, as we were thinking about before, there are many schools of Indian thought who disagree in the theoretical mirror. They might have different theoretical or conceptual or metaphysical claims about the universe, but all of them are unified through the search for deliverance through self-knowledge, based upon a way of life that involves all that you are. And so it embodies a radical questioning that changes you in your life in the process of the questioning. I said that your very life becomes the question in the wonder and terror of the speculative vision. Now at this point, usually I'd ask you if you have any questions about what we went over last time. But sadly, because of the pandemic, here I am talking to you on a video. So write down your questions, if you have any, and bring them with you to our next Zoom session. All right. Now, to emphasize the point I've just made, we can ask, the question's so important after all, it involves all my life. What if the answer is wrong? How do I tell a right answer from a wrong one? Well, there are two ways you could justify a philosophy or a darshana. You could do it through conceptual analysis, and you can do it through the quality of life that results from following that philosophy. As we've said, the problem with conceptual analysis is that several philosophies, several darshanas, several philosophical visions could be consistent within themselves. They could develop a consistent logical mirroring of their vision of reality, and yet be incompatible with each other in the logical sense. Those who studied logic will understand the difference here between validity and soundness. An argument can be valid, which means it has a structure such that if the premises are true, the conclusion must follow from those premises, but that doesn't make it sound, right? An argument is only sound if the premises you've chosen are actually real, right? So, in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, if there are any students in the class who've studied that in another class, they have what Kant called antinomies. There are these positions that are logically consistent but claim the opposite thing. So one could claim that reality is one, or a unity, or it's a duality, it's many. And for each one, you could give valid arguments and develop a consistent logical system. Or you could argue that the soul exists or it doesn't exist, or that God exists or God does not exist. And the important thing to realize is these accounts could be coherent. They could hang together consistently in the logical mirror and have valid arguments for the positions that result. But the fact that a truth is more than logical doesn't mean it's less than logical. And here we see something important in Indian thought. It is important that a darshana hang together on some level in the logical mirror. Reasoning of that sort is not jettisoned, even if it is not given supreme place. But listen, if there's more to logic, that doesn't mean you reject the logic. Just because all wisdom is knowledge does not mean all knowledge is wisdom, right? It may be that to be wise you have to have knowledge, but knowledge could still be more than that. It's a simple logical point. Compare it with the statement, all men are humans. That does not mean all humans are men. Humans is a broader category than men, which includes other beings of various orientations, right? And so wisdom is a broader category of knowledge, but knowledge is still included within it. And here we come to an important point, right? Think about levels of knowing first, just levels of knowledge. We could think about just being flat out irrational. And then there's what is rational. Now maybe there's something else we could call the transrational. Suppose you were raised in a culture that only recognized these two levels of cognition. If some bit or data of experience came into your field of experience, right, some data comes in, you can either find it rational or irrational. But if there's another level of thought which did not reject the second level, but transcended it yet included it, you might have more to think about. Now, there's an important concept here. I have the German here because the philosopher who has most fully developed this idea is Hegel, the 19th century German philosopher. And we can translate it as sublation. And when something is sublated, the sublation preserves the essence of a thing, what's important about it, but negates the partiality. So we say it transcends yet includes the basic structures or functions of a thing while taking it up into a wider identity. As an example, think about a state in relation to the federal government. For example, consider California before it became a state. Before it became a state, it was essentially its own nation. And as a nation, it had all the prerogatives of sovereignty. It could declare war, print its own money, have an army, and so on. And these were all parts of its agency as a whole, as an individual nation. Now, when California became part of the United States of America, all of its basic property, land, and fundamental features became a part of the United States. All of these basic structures were preserved in the new union. None of them were destroyed or harmed in the least. Excuse me, I need a little coffee. It's early here. What was not preserved, however, what was lost and actually negated, was California's capacity to be its own nation, to declare war, print its own money, and so on. California's isolated regime was sublated into the higher regime of the United States. Now, this is what I mean when I say something transcends but includes or negates and preserves all the basic structures and functions that are taken up into a larger identity, right? All the exclusivity structures and functions that exist because of isolation and partialness are dropped and replaced with a deeper agency that allows us to see and do more things. So we might think about the rational being lifted up, sublated into the transrational. So what is good in the rational, what makes us effective in the world, is taken up into the transrational. It's still there. You still reason, you still do logic, but it's done in a broader context. Consider what is essential to being rational. Let's think about that. We're going to read a section from a book called Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality by Ken Wilber, which is really a great book, and one I study in my you could study with me in my metaphysics class. So I'm just going to read this to you. If we were in class, you would read it to me. I would have each of you read a paragraph of it aloud, and we'd stop and talk about it. But darn it, we can't do that. So instead, right, I'm going to read it to you, and you can pay attention. If I want to know whether it's raining or not, I go to the window and look out, and sure enough, rain. But perhaps I am mistaken, or perhaps my eyesight is poor. Would you check? You go to the window, and yes, it's raining. This is a very simplified form of the three strands of any valid knowledge quest. In other words, this is what is essential to rationality. The first is injunction, which is always of the form, if you want to know this, do this. If you want to know if a cell has a nucleus, then get a microscope. Learn to take histological sections, stain the cell, put it under the microscope, and look. If you want to know whether 2 plus 2 is really 4, then learn arithmetic theory, take the theorems, and run them through your mind and check the results. So, Ken Wilber writes, the various injunctions, in other words, lead to or disclose or open up the possibility of an illumination, an apprehension, an intuition, or a direct experiencing of the domain addressed by the injunction. You see the meaning of Hamlet, or whether it is raining, or why 2 plus 2 really is 4. That is the second strand, the illumination or apprehension. You see or apprehend via direct experience the disclosed data of the domain. But you could be mistaken, Wilber writes, unless you check your results, your data with others who have completed the first 2 strands, with others who have performed the injunctions and obtained the data. In this community of peers, you compare and confirm or reject your original data. And this is the third strand, communal confirmation or refutation. Now, Wilber continues, writing that these 3 strands, injunction, illumination, confirmation, are the major components in any valid knowledge quest. In other words, they're at the heart of what we mean by rationality. And this draws attention to the importance of injunctions or actual practices in generating knowledge, and further in generating the type of knowledge that could be articulated in a given world space. In other words, that's why you have biology lab if you're studying biology. That's why you have physics lab if you're studying physics. Anyway, Wilber continues, that is, social practices or social injunctions are crucial in creating and disclosing the type of world spaces in which types of subjects and objects appear, and thus the types of knowledge that can unfold. The reference of knowledge exists only in specific world spaces, and these world spaces are not simply given empirically lying around for all and sundry to perceive. Rather, these world spaces are disclosed by cognitive transformations in the context of background injunctions or social practices. I mean, imagine if I went for a walk in a salt marsh with one of my colleagues from biology. They would see all kinds of things I couldn't see. They would see what type of seagrasses were there. They would understand which ones were tolerant to salt and which were not. They would see organisms in the environment and know their name and know how they functioned in that environment. Now that's what Wilber means here by a world space being opened up. Their biological training enabled them to see things that I can't see. A whole world opened up before them. Now if my biology professor friend went with me to look at a Greek text, and he looked at the Greek and he'd never studied Greek, he couldn't enter the world space of Greek. Right? He couldn't see what was being seen there. Or if you didn't know English, these words wouldn't mean anything to you, and the world space of the English language wouldn't be open to you. So Wilber says, put simply, the first strand of knowledge accumulation is never simply look. It is do this, then look. And here's the point. The transrational traditions, the kinds of philosophies we're thinking about, and what I'm calling the transrational, are a higher level of cognition, operates with these elements of reason. These are the parts of reason that are taken up into it and preserved, right, in this higher level of knowing. So Wilber writes, the contemplative traditions, on the other hand, have always come first and foremost with a set of injunctions in hand. They are above all else a set of practices that require years to master, much longer than the training of the average scientist. These injunctions, such as zazen, shikantaza, vipassana, contemplative introspection, satsang, darshan, these are not things to think, they're things to do. But you can think them, but that's not at the heart of it. Just like being a biologist is not knowing biological theory, but being able to actually identify organisms and experiment on them and learn things about them. Right? Now, Wilber writes, once one masters the exemplar, or paradigmatic practice, strand 1, then one is ushered into a world space in which new data disclose themselves, strand 2. These are direct apprehensions or illumination. In other words, direct spiritual or transrational experiences, such as Satori, Kensho, Shaktipat, Nada, Shabad, etc. These data are rigorously checked, strand 3, in the community of those who have completed the first strands. Oh, look, I need to go up on the board and add something in the community of those who've also completed the first 2 strands, injunction and illumination. Bad data are rebuffed by the community of those whose cognitive eyes are adequate to the addressed domain. Wilbur concludes that, in short, the contemplative disclosures are open to the fallibilist criteria of all genuine knowledge, because the contemplative path follows all 3 strands of any valid knowledge accumulation. The rational is sublated or taken up into the transrational, which includes what's important about it. Now, this concept of moving through levels of knowledge to a higher level of knowing is so important in the philosophies we're considering that we're going to spend a little more time on it. And one way we can do this is by looking at the great Piaget's stages of cognitive development. If you've studied any psychology, you probably know about Piaget. He studies how our cognition develops from when we're infants to when we're adults, and the different ways we learn and know. And there are many classic experiments and studies he's done with children looking at how they develop. And you have stages of development that we've all gone through. We all start, for example, at what he calls the sensory motor stage, from birth to 2 years. And if you look at children under the age of 2, they don't really use language as a means of figuring out their environment. Children at this stage discover by sensing and doing. Infants come to realize that events may have causes, and some behaviors cause certain reactions. For example, a child may realize that pulling a dog's tail will cause the dog to produce a loud yelp. And then you have to tell them not to do that, right? But during this period, babies will also imitate almost any behavior he or she sees, as long as it is within the baby's range of abilities. Just yesterday, I was hanging out with my 1-year-old grandson, Griffin, and he was fascinated with the ibises that were walking about on the lawn. And I would say, bird, and he'd say, buh, 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 right? He's at the sensory motor stage. Later in the period, children begin to learn that objects can exist even when they're not in view, playing peekaboo. So Griffin loves it when I take my sunglasses and go, peekaboo, and then he laughs. So that's where we begin. That's one stage. And then we move beyond the sensory motor stage. And everything that's good about sensory motor development, being able to hear, see, take things in, basic sensory experience and feeling, is preserved, but we move into a broader range of abilities. At this point, a child can now recognize that he or she is a separate, independent person in the world, right? And this is called the pre-operational stage, roughly from 2 to 6 years. This is the stage my granddaughter, Juniper, is in. And the world is very much me, mine, and I oriented. So Juniper sometimes needs us to create a little space just for her that her little brother Griffin can't come into because she wants her own place. And there's nothing wrong with having your own place. When we move into higher stages, we'll still have a need to have our own place, and there's nothing wrong with it, but it'll be in a broader context of learning to share. Now, Piaget believes that this stage is when children begin to use symbols but cannot consciously manipulate them. This means that children cannot take 2 things into consideration at the same time. If you were to take something apart and put it back together, they wouldn't really understand this action because they cannot think the inverse. There's an absolutely fascinating experiment Piaget did with his water level experiment, right? You have 3 flasks, and in these 2 flasks, you have the same volume of liquid. And you have a tall flask, and you pour the water from the short round flask into the tall flask. It has the same volume. Right? So in this experiment, a child is presented with 2 identical glasses, which are short and fat, and then the experimenter pours the water from the short and fat glass into the taller one, and the child is then asked if glasses B and C had the same amount of liquid. A pre-operational child would say no. He or she believes that the taller, thinner glass contains more water. They just can't see it. The world space that they would need to inhabit at a higher level of cognition is simply not there. So at this period, they cannot mentally reverse the task. At this stage, instead, you have the ability to represent. Representing is how one records or expresses information. For example, a child can imitate some objects or activities they previously witnessed, and children at this stage enjoy symbolic play. They love to pretend they are someone or something else. Juniper and I, and Juniper's 3, we love to play pirates. We go outside and play pirates, and I'm Captain Granddad, and she's my first matey. And we run around, and I say, "Arr, I'm Captain Granddad," and she says, "Arr, I'm the first matey." And we take these little golden coins I bought, and we bury them in the ground, and we hunt for them. Anyway, that's what's important about this stage, right? At this stage, the child gets to discover what objects in their environment are supposed to do. Like shovels dig holes in the ground, and treasure gets buried in it, and you hide it, and X marks the spot, matey. So symbolic play allows children to understand and learn what they've witnessed, and to prepare for a higher stage. The next stage that develops is the concrete operational stage, and children can now solve the water level problem. They no longer concentrate solely on the height of the glasses, but consider the width as well. And in fact, one interesting thing that developed when Piaget would bring back children who had earlier gone through the water level experiment and showed them a film of them not recognizing that the two glasses had the same volume of water, they don't believe that it's them, or they believe that the film's been doctored because they can't believe someone would be so stupid as not to see that. So they refuse to believe it's them, right? They've entered a new world space. Before, the child could look at the two things of water, and they could not understand, could not see. We're not in the world space where they could abstract and understand the concept of equal volumes. Right? Now, during this stage, children develop many concepts and show how they can manipulate them. They have the ability to classify, rank, and separate objects, and they can group different objects that have something in common, and they can solve the classic conservation problems, right? Like the water having the same volume. Or suppose a child is showed two equally sized balls of clay, and then one ball of clay is rolled into a long cigar shape. Well, the child at this stage can tell that there's the same amount of clay, whereas in the previous stage they couldn't. And finally, the previous stage being sublated, but everything that's important in it being taken up into this new stage, we enter what's called form-op, or the formal operational stage, where we can now manipulate abstract concepts. Children can reason through hypothetical problems, and in other words, they can work through problems in their mind. They could calculate the chemical structure of the water if shown how to do so through chemical formulae, and so on. Right? At this level, children can deal with questions that are not factual. For example, they can answer a question like, what if you were the only person that had to go to school? Or what if it were as if I were not here? This is the level that typically we call rationality, which develops and develops from very simple problems to very complex ones, to very complex ones indeed, like Einstein's theory of relativity, and so on. So remember again the concept of Aufheben, or sublation. When something is sublated, the sublation preserves the essence but negates the partiality. It transcends yet includes the basic structures or functions while taking it up into a wider identity. So we could say that the sensory motor stage is sublated by the pre-operational stage, so everything important about the first stage is still in effect, but everything limiting about it is abolished. The pre-operational is then sublated by the concrete operational stage, and it in turn is sublated by the formal operational stage. What is important in each level is taken up into the next, while what is limiting fades away. Now suppose with me there is another stage of human consciousness, which we could call the transrational or transpersonal stage, which then sublates the formal operational stage. The new stage or level of knowing would then include the basic elements of rationality, the three strands of any valid knowledge quest, but would have a deeper agency that reveals new things to the mind. Right? So we have the different levels. First, there's simple irrationality. Then we enter the sensory motor stage, or world space, as Wilber calls it. The sensory motor stage is sublated up into the pre-operational, which includes everything good about the sensory motor stage, but opens up a broader reality. The same thing happens with the move from pre-operational to concrete operational, right? From being able to see the volume of water is the same to not being able to see it to being able to see it, then to the formal operational stage, what we mean by rationality, and then to what we're calling the transrational or the transpersonal, a higher level of cognitive development. And what's important to see is by the transrational, we don't mean anything mystical. We don't mean anything magical. We just mean higher levels of human cognition that our culture has suppressed or ignored, and becoming so enchanted with the formal operational because it gives us so much power. And the idea this is not a bad thing, no one would say that. I mean, the essence of formal operational for us is science and mathematics, and it's a powerful tool. But what if we viewed that powerful tool in a broader context? Right? Everything that's good about science would be taken up into this, but we would have a deeper and wider agency or communion and understanding of the world around us. Now, for us, modern peoples, rationality is only formal operational thought. That's all we mean by it. For example, college is preeminently the place where we learn to hone our abilities in formal operational thought. That we try to get really good at it. And then as you move up, like say you got a master's or a PhD, you're beginning to enter the higher levels of formal operational thought. And then the very best of us, right? People like Einstein, say, he's the one who always comes to mind. They are at the very pinnacle of this formal operational thought. Now, if you're at the level of formal operational thought and you think that's all there is, if transrational or transpersonal data comes in, a person limited to the rational would just have to say it was irrational. They would not have the intellectual development or cognitive tools to see it. In viewing what we could call a transrational phenomenon, they would be like the pre-operational child looking at the 2 glasses of water. Now I want you to listen to something. Again, if we were in class, I'd have this as a printout, and we would read it together, and we'd take turns reading it and talking about it. But again, we can't do that because of this damn pandemic. Okay? So as I'm talking, if you have questions, write them down. Right? If there are things that confuse you, write them down. And then when we all Zoom together, you can ask me about them. Okay? So now listen. And this is again from Ken Wilber, that great book I mentioned, Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality, which is not from Shambhala Press, but from Shambhala Press. So, listen and pay attention. The common objections to these philosophies are not very compelling. The most typical objection is to call them mystical and say that they're private and interior and cannot be publicly validated, but they are merely subjective. Wilber writes, this is simply not true. Or rather, if it is true, then it applies to any and all non-empirical endeavors, from mathematics to literature to linguistics to psychoanalysis to historical interpretation. Nobody has ever seen out there in the sensory world -6. That is a mathematical symbol seen only inwardly, privately, with the mind's eye. Yet a community of trained mathematicians know exactly what -6 means, right? Or even the square root of -6. And they can share that symbol easily in intersubjective awareness. And they can confirm or reject the proper and consistent uses of that symbol using the 3 strands of any valid knowledge quest. Just so, the private experiences of the contemplative traditions can be shared with a community of trained contemplatives, grounded in a common and shared experience, and open to confirmation or rejection based on public evidence. Again, following the 3 strands of any valid knowledge quest, as Wilber calls it. So Wilber continues, there is, of course, one proviso. The person must, in his or her own case, have developed the requisite cognitive tools. If, for example, we want to investigate concrete operational thought, a community of those who've only developed to the pre-operational level will not do. If you take a pre-op child and in front of the child pour the water from a short, fat glass into a tall, thin glass, the child will tell you that the tall glass has more water. If you say, no, there's the same amount of water in both glasses, because you just saw me pour the same water from one glass to the other, the child will have no idea of what you're talking about. No, the tall glass has more water. No matter how many times you pour the water back and forth between the 2 glasses, the child will deny that they have the same amount of water. Interestingly, if you videotape the child at this stage and then wait a few years until the child has developed concrete operational thought, at which point it will seem utterly obvious to him that the glasses have the same amount of water, and then show the child the earlier videotape, they will deny it's them. They think you've doctored the videotape. They cannot imagine anyone being that stupid. The pre-operational child is immersed in a world that includes concrete operational realities, is drenched in these realities, and yet cannot see them. They all seem otherworldly. Wilber continues, at every stage of development, in fact, the next higher stage always appears to be a completely other world, an invisible world. It has literally no existence for the individual, even though the individual is in fact saturated with a reality that contains the other world. The individual's this-worldly existence simply cannot comprehend the otherworldly characteristics lying all around them. And the point Wilber is making here is it isn't really otherworldly. I remember when I first took biology lab and tried to examine a cell through a microscope, and I'd look at the diagram of the cell, which gave me the theoretical structure of it, and I'd look at the cell that was actually there in front of my eyes, and I just couldn't see it. I couldn't see it until I'd trained my eyes to see what was right there in front of me. The structure of the cell was laying out there right in front of me, but I had to learn how to see it. I had to learn to enter the biological world space. So Wilber continues, and he writes, at the same time, these higher or deeper world spaces, whether concrete operational or form operational, or maybe the transrational, are not located elsewhere in physical space-time. They are located here, in deeper perceptions of this world. Other worlds, so to speak, become this world with increasing development and evolution. I mean, the child didn't literally go into another world when they moved from pre-operational to concrete operational. And one level of development, they lived in a world where the tall, thin glass had more water in it. They couldn't see that it had the same amount of water. It was like, and to be able to think that way would be like thinking there's another world you have to enter, right? Another world of thought. Wilber continues, the world space of the concrete operational is a completely other world to the pre-operational child, even though he or she is often staring directly at it. Another world that nonetheless becomes perfectly obvious, present, seen, and this worldly at the concrete operational stage. What was the fuss all about? But prior to the increased development and evolution, there is nothing from the present this world that will allow the child to adequately grasp the other world, or else the other world would have already become a real this world. Just so with the higher or transpersonal or transrational developments. Wilbur writes, if you explain these things to someone at the rational level, all you get at best is that deer caught in the headlight blank stare. Or at worst, you get something like, and did we forget to take our meds today? Wilbur writes, so the first thing I would like to emphasize is that the higher stages of transrational development are stages that are taken from those who've actually developed into these stages and who display palpable, discernible, and repeatable characteristics of that development. These stages themselves can be rationally reconstructed, explained in a rational manner, but they cannot be rationally experienced. Now, this rational reconstruction, right, that's what I meant in an earlier lecture when I talked about the traces and tracks of thought falling out of your experience when you move into that gap where wonder and terror fill you, and you begin to see things in a new way. And as you begin to think about them and write about them, you're rationally reconstructing this experience you had, and that rational reconstruction is a finger pointing at the moon. Right? That's just what Wilbur means here. The stages themselves can be rationally reconstructed, explained in a rational manner, but they cannot be rationally experienced. So Wilbur writes, they can be experienced only by a transrational contemplative development, whose stages unfold in the same manner as any other developmental stages, and whose experiences are every bit as real as others. And there's nothing mystical about it. It's simply a continual development of human cognition. Wilbur continues, but one must be adequate to the experience, or it remains an invisible other world, just like the world of the water with equal volumes. When the yogis and sages and contemplatives make a statement like, the entire world is a manifestation of oneself, or Brahman, that is not a merely rational statement that we are to think about and see if it makes logical sense. It is rather a description, often poetic, of a direct apprehension or a direct experience. And we are to test this direct experience, not by mulling it over philosophically, but by taking up the experimental method of contemplative awareness, developing the requisite cognitive tools, and then directly looking for ourselves. As Emerson put it, what we are that only we can see. I mean, what Wilbur's getting at is something worth thinking about even more, right? I mean, there's nothing mystical about what the philosophers of the Upanishads are talking about. If you mean by mystical, you mean sort of woo-woo, otherworldly or supernatural. There's nothing like that. Just think about, for example, coffee and what it tastes like. And suppose you'd never had coffee. Well, if I talk to you about coffee, I'd say it's sweet but kind of bitter. You'd say, what? Sweet but kind of bitter? And it gives you a buzz, and you'd say, what? Right? And I could teach you to make coffee. Right? I could give you a recipe that would be like the theory of coffee. Right? But then you'd have to make the coffee and drink it. And we can rationally reconstruct coffee. I mean, we could get real high level with it. We could talk about taste receptors in the tongue and how scent is involved and how the scent goes up into the scent receptors and how the nerves are stimulated and how it affects my brain centers and my pleasure centers and how the caffeine stimulates my body. And we could talk about the chemical reactions. And that would be a rational reconstruction. But it wouldn't capture you doing this, right? You have to actually experience it. You have to enter the coffee world. So it's the same when the sages of the Upanishads talk about experiencing everything as being united into one, right? The words are a rational reconstruction, but they're only a finger pointing at the moon, right? This is any statement about coffee would be a finger pointing at the moon of the experience of taking a drink. So we can see this idea of levels of knowing in the Upanishads. Right? Here we're looking at the Katha Upanishads again. But he who has understanding, is careful and ever pure, reaches the end of the journey, from which he never returns. The man whose chariot is driven by reason, who watches and holds the reins of his mind, reaches the end of the journey, the supreme everlasting spirit. But what is reason? Right? It's something richer. See them talking here about the different levels. Beyond the senses are their objects, the sensory motor, and beyond the objects is the mind. We're talking about the concrete operational, and beyond the mind is pure reason, the formal operational, and beyond reason is the spirit in man, the transrational operational, we might call it. Beyond the spirit of man is the spirit of the universe. Oh, and there's even more levels. And beyond is Purusha, the spirit supreme. Nothing is beyond Purusha. He is the end of the path. The light of the Atman, the spirit, is invisible, concealed in all beings. It is seen by seers of the subtle, when their vision is keen and clear. And so you enter into a community who is able to see the Atman. You go and Upanishad, sit down by them. Just like if you're a biology or physics student, you go in Upanishad next to your physics professor or biology professor, and you go to lab and you learn how to enter the world of biology. And you could take a walk in the salt marsh and see things I could never see because I never entered that world. And so, too, you could go sit down by one of the sages, right? One of the forest monks, and learn the practices and the injunctions and enter the community of the transrational. And they claim, learn to experience the Atman, the spirit, which is otherworldly or invisible, appears to be concealed, but is really right there in front of us if we develop what Wilber calls the requisite cognitive tools. Beyond mind is something, beyond mind is reason, beyond reason is pure reason, and then we come to the spirit, right? And this spirit seems somehow mystical or irrational to those who do not have the requisite cognitive development, just like the child with the glasses of water. But to those who have developed to this stage, the higher reasoning recognizes the insufficiency of logic alone to decide. But remember, just because logic alone can't decide an issue doesn't mean you jettison logic. You take it up with you. It's subblated into a higher realm, and it operates in a broader context. Now, you see the same thing in Plato, by the way, if you've studied him with me or otherwise read about him in his idea of the divided line, right? In the divided line, what we're calling rational thought, right, is the third level of the divided line, and beyond it he has what we're calling the transrational, which is at the fourth level of his divided line. So in the ancient West, as well as in the ancient East, you see these things. In fact, it's so common that some people call this the perennial philosophy, because you find these ideas in all traditional cultures. You find them in indigenous cultures and in indigenous philosophies and in many ancient Western or Eastern philosophies. But the modern world has just fallen in love with rationality, with formal operational thought, and we've not paid as much attention to these things. Right? So to those who develop to this stage, the higher reasoning recognizes the insufficiency of logic alone to decide. But logic is still there with you. It can be rationally reconstructed, but you understand that the logic of it is just a finger pointing at the moon. Because to ultimately justify a darshana, or a philosophy, remember, for these thinkers, you need to examine the quality of the life that results from practicing it. Practice is the ultimate condition of truth in the philosophy of the Upanishads. You're not interested in truth, theoretically, but a life of truth. When we ask of something, is it true, we usually mean, is it a fact, a bit of knowledge? Does it fit in with our theoretical perspective? But in the philosophy of the Upanishads, Is it true means both. Is it a fact? And does it transform your life? The quality of life lived according to the ideas is the ultimate test of a darshana. So we'll pick this up again next time. And I want to thank you for your kind attention.